Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to talk about a really significant piece of legislation coming out of Connecticut. It's House Bill 5156, and people are calling it the Climate Superfund. Now, the big idea here is to make major fossil fuel companies pay for climate-related projects. But how does it actually work? And what are the potential ripple effects? Let's break it all down.
This whole thing really boils down to one massive question. Who should be picking up the tab for climate change? It's a huge, complicated debate, and HB 5156 offers one very specific and, pretty controversial answer. So before we get into all the back and forth about it, let's just understand the mechanics. How is this bill actually supposed to function on paper? At its heart, the bill creates something called a cost recovery program. Basically, it's a new fund, and it's going to be run by Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, which you'll hear called DEEP. The whole point is to collect money from certain companies to fund projects that help the state get ready for the impacts of climate change. The process is designed to work in 4 key steps. First, the state agency, DEEP, goes and identifies the big fossil fuel companies it wants to target based on their emissions going all the way back to 1995. Second, it does the math and figures out each company's share of the total cost. Third, it sends them a bill. Officially, it's called a cost recovery demand. And finally, that money goes into the fund to be spent on those climate projects. So what kind of projects are we talking about here? Well, the list is pretty broad. It covers everything from really tangible stuff like building flood walls and upgrading roads and bridges to retrofitting buildings to be more efficient, creating local microgrids, restoring natural ecosystems, and even putting money into public health initiatives. The key phrase for all of this is climate resilience. Okay, so that's the plan. That's how it's supposed to work. But, and this is a big but, the source material we're analyzing raises some major concerns. And the first potential pitfall it highlights is what you might call a hidden cost. This brings us right back to that fundamental question we started with. The bill might be aimed squarely at big companies, but the source wants us to ask, where does that money really come from? Who ends up actually footing the bill?
And here's the core of that argument. While the bill's stated target is large fossil fuel corporations, the deep concern is that the financial burden won't just stop there. The argument is that it could trickle all the way down and land right on Connecticut households.
So how would that even happen? Well, the source points out that when you add huge new costs to the energy supply chain, those costs tend to get passed along to customers. That could show up as higher prices for your home heating oil or natural gas. It could mean paying more for gasoline at the pump, seeing a jump in your utility bills, and maybe even paying more for everyday goods since it costs more to ship them.
Now, the second major issue that the source brings up isn't just about economics. It's about the legal process itself. This one gets into a really fundamental question of fairness and something called due process. There's a simple phrase from the source that really nails this concern. Bill first, fight later. Let's take a closer look at what that actually means in practice.
It all comes down to this idea of due process. In just plain English, due process is the bedrock principle that the government has to prove its case. It has to show you did something wrong before it can hit you with a fine or a penalty. It's a cornerstone of our legal system. And here you can see the big difference. In a traditional process, you go to court, evidence is presented to a neutral party like a judge, and then a penalty might be handed down. But the source argues that HB 5056 completely flips that script. The state agency issues the penalty first, and only after that does the company get a chance to appeal it. So the crucial point here is that this bill would give one single state agency, DEEP, the power to be the investigator, the decision maker, and the bill collector, all rolled into one. A company gets its bill and has to start what's essentially an uphill legal battle, all before the case has ever been tested in a neutral court of law. All right, so after laying out these pretty serious concerns, the source doesn't just stop there. It actually proposes a different way forward, 4 specific amendments that it calls common sense fixes to try and address these problems.
Let's quickly run through them. First, a court-first approach. This means no bill gets sent out until a court has actually determined who's responsible. Second, real oversight, which means transparent reporting and independent audits so everyone can see where every single dollar is going.
Third, and this is a big one, an explicit rule protecting ratepayers that would legally prohibit companies from just passing these costs on to Connecticut families. And fourth, what the source calls honest attribution, making sure the policy is based on the full, complex picture of causality, not a simplified single-cause story.
You know, when you take a step back, what this all really comes down to is a balancing act. The source is suggesting that while the goal of building climate resilience is absolutely critical, it has to be balanced against these core principles of a fair legal process and making sure households aren't the ones left shouldering the financial burden.
And that really leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question. When we're trying to tackle a challenge as immense as climate change, do we have to choose between building resilience and protecting people's rights and their financial well-being, or is there a way to actually achieve both? That's the core tension right at the heart of this entire debate over HB 5156.